Okay, so are you ready for this? Today, we are taking a deep dive into the mind of a philosopher who makes even the most cynical among us, seem like optimistic, like rays of sunshine.
Right.
We're talking about Arthur Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, this guy, he had some serious thoughts about human nature.
He really did.
Really did.
Yeah. Schopenhauer, he was writing in the mid-19th century, and he did not pull any punches. He drew on ideas from, like, ancient philosophy, the Enlightenment, even Eastern traditions.
Wow.
But he kind of wove them all together into his own, let's say, unique perspective.
Unique is one way to put it.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin to unpack this guy's philosophy? What's the foundation he's building all this on?
Yeah, so at the core of Schopenhauer's thinking is this concept he calls the will to live. And he doesn't just mean, like, our basic survival instinct.
Right.
He's talking about, like, a really powerful, relentless force, like almost like an engine.
Oh, wow.
That drives all living things.
Everything.
Humans, animals, even plants, towards this constant striving.
Wow.
And here's the kicker. It's not about happiness.
Yeah.
It's not about reason. It's just this blind, unceasing urge to be, to do, to have more.
Okay. I'm starting to see why you called his views unique.
Yeah.
So it's not just like, your cat batting at a laser pointer at 3:00 a.m.
Right.
It's like the very nature of existence that's pushing us all towards suffering, misery.
Well, yeah, that's where it gets really interesting, because Schopenhauer observed that this will to live playing out in a world of limited resources
Right.
inevitably leads to conflict. And he saw humanity as driven by this force, yes, but also tragically prone to causing suffering, both to ourselves and to each other as a result of it.
So we're all just kind of like hardwired for conflict. Is that what he's saying?
Essentially, yes. He even points to those seemingly harmless acts of childhood cruelty.
Okay.
Like, remember when you were a kid, maybe, and you'd pull the wings off flies?
Okay, first of all, absolutely no, never did that.
Okay.
But I could see where you're going with this.
Right.
So even in those small, seemingly insignificant acts,
Yeah.
Schopenhauer sees evidence of this deeper, darker drives within us.
Exactly. He's not saying we're all inherently evil, necessarily.
Okay.
But he is saying that this will to live, in its very essence, is egoistic. It's about the individual striving for its own fulfillment, often at the expense of others.
And this egoism, this self-interest, it trumps everything else.
He would argue that it often does.
Wow.
Reason, logic, even basic human decency. He goes so far as to say that much of what we consider dignity is an illusion. We humans, with all our flaws and this constant striving for more, for ourselves, well, he finds it a bit ironic that we would claim any kind of special moral status.
Ouch. Okay. That's pretty bleak even for a Monday morning. So if we're all just these bundles of ego driven by this insatiable will, where does morality even fit in? Are we just doomed to be awful to each other?
That's where Schopenhauer takes a turn that might surprise you.
Okay.
He doesn't see morality as a simple choice between good and evil, or as a set of rules that we're just supposed to follow. He believes that true morality arises from something much deeper, something that actually stems from recognizing our interconnectedness with all beings.
Interconnectedness. So it's not about, like, fighting against this will to live,
Right.
but about understanding it, maybe even tapping into it in a different way.
Exactly. And this is where his ideas get really fascinating, because he's not just talking about some abstract sense of oneness. He's talking about recognizing the shared nature of this will in all living things. That, for Schopenhauer, is where true compassion comes from.
Okay. I'm definitely intrigued. But I have to ask, if this will to live is such a powerful force, do we even have a choice in how we express it? Is he saying free will is an illusion too?
Well, that's a question that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries.
Right.
But Schopenhauer's take on it is, shall we say, distinctive. He actually compares human lives to clockwork, suggesting that our choices are largely predetermined by our nature and the circumstances we encounter.
Hold on. So he's saying we're all just cogs in this giant cosmic machine,
Right.
destined to play out our predetermined roles.
Mm-hmm.
Where does that leave any hope for personal growth, for becoming better versions of ourselves?
That's a question a lot of people have when they first encounter Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
And it's an important one, but that's where we start to see the nuances in his thinking. Because while he may seem deterministic, even a bit bleak at times, he does offer a path to a more ethical way of being. And it's not about denying our nature, but about understanding it and then perhaps transcending it. It's about recognizing, as he put it, that this is thyself, tat famasi in Sanskrit. It's about seeing our own will, our own suffering, reflected in the experiences of others.
So instead of focusing on our differences, our individual desires, we should try to look for that common thread, like that shared will to live that connects us all.
Precisely. And for Schopenhauer, that recognition, that connection, is the key to genuine morality. It's about acting in a way that acknowledges the inherent value of all beings, not just our own.
That actually makes a lot of sense, but it also feels kind of radical, you know? Like he's flipping the script on how we usually think about morality. It's not about following rules or seeking rewards. It's about this deep, almost intuitive understanding of our interconnectedness.
It is radical, especially for his time. And he goes on to illustrate this with some pretty striking examples. He talks about a soldier who, facing his own execution, is more concerned with shielding his dog from witnessing it. He describes a son who sacrifices himself to save his father from a volcanic eruption. These are acts of selflessness, of compassion, that arise not from rational calculation, but from something deeper, something that transcends the individual ego.
It's like in those moments, they're not even thinking about themselves anymore. They're acting purely out of this recognition of a shared will, a shared vulnerability, even in the face of death. It's both beautiful and kind of terrifying at the same time.
Exactly. And it's in these moments that Schopenhauer sees a glimmer of hope for humanity. Because if we can tap into that deeper wellspring of compassion, even if it's fleeting, it suggests that we're not entirely bound by our egoistic desires, that there's a possibility of transcending our baser instincts.
Okay, so we've gone from humans are basically doomed to conflict to maybe there's hope for us yet in the span of 20 minutes. I'm starting to see why people find Schopenhauer so compelling, even if he can be a bit of a downer sometimes.
Yeah, he definitely makes you think. But his ideas aren't just about individual morality, though. He applies the same unflinching lens to society as a whole.
Oh, wait.
And spoiler alert, he's not exactly optimistic about our ability to, govern ourselves.
Oh, I bet. So what's his take on the whole, social contract thing? Does he see any hope for creating a just and equitable society, given his views on human nature?
Well, he does acknowledge the need for some form of government. He sees it as a necessary evil, really, something required to curb our natural tendencies towards conflict and injustice. He even refers to the state as a fool's paradise.
A fool's paradise. Okay, that's not exactly a ringing endorsement of democracy. What's so bad about trying to create a system where everyone's needs are met, where we strive for equality and fairness?
Well, remember that whole will to live thing? Schopenhauer believes that at its core, the state is just another manifestation of this will, another arena where individual egos clash and compete for power and resources.
Okay.
He argues that even the most well-intentioned attempts to create a utopia are ultimately doomed to fail because they don't address the fundamental nature of human desire.
So anarchy it is then. If we're all just going to screw it up anyway, why even bother with government at all?
Not quite. Schopenhauer wouldn't advocate for anarchy either. Remember, he sees the state as a necessary evil, a way to at least contain the worst excesses of our egoism. And this is where he gets really interesting, because he actually expresses a surprising preference for, wait for it, monarchy.
Wait, monarchy? Seriously? That seems a bit, shall we say, counterintuitive, given everything else we've talked about.
It does, doesn't it? But Schopenhauer's reasoning is actually pretty consistent with his overall philosophy. He argues that monarchy, for all its flaws, aligns better with our natural instincts for hierarchy. He believes that most people are simply not equipped to handle the responsibility of self-governance, and that a strong, capable ruler is necessary to prevent society from descending into chaos.
Okay, so he's basically saying that most of us are just not cut out for democracy, that we need a benevolent dictator to keep us all in line.
In a nutshell, yeah. He believed that a monarchy, with a wise and just ruler, could provide the stability and order necessary for society to function, even if it didn't necessarily lead to happiness for everyone. And he argued that this, controlled despotism, as he called it, might be preferable to the chaos and instability of a system where everyone is left to their own devices.
A controlled despotism. It does have a certain ring to it, I'll give him that. But it also seems a bit, contradictory. He's all about recognizing our interconnectedness, our shared humanity, but then he advocates for a system that inherently creates division and inequality.
That's a fair point. And it highlights the tension that runs through a lot of Schopenhauer's work. He's acutely aware of the flaws of human nature, both individually and collectively, but he doesn't necessarily offer any easy solutions. He's more interested in understanding the forces at play, the underlying will that drives us, even if that understanding leads to some uncomfortable conclusions.
So we're stuck with this paradox. We're capable of great compassion, but also prone to selfishness and conflict. We need some form of government, but it's always going to be imperfect, a reflection of our own limitations. It's enough to make you want to just crawl back in bed and pull the covers over your head.
Well, I wouldn't recommend that just yet because Schopenhauer's insights, even if they're not always cheerful, can actually be quite liberating. And he does offer some clues about how we can navigate this messy, complicated world.
Okay, I'm listening. Give me some of that Schopenhauerian wisdom to help me get through the rest of this week.
Well, remember his analogy of the clockwork. Our lives might be like clockwork in some ways, but he also acknowledges the power of the mind, of self-awareness, to at least influence the gears.
So it's not about denying our nature, but understanding it and maybe even transcending it through awareness. But how do we actually do that? Like, how do we become more aware of this will driving us, especially when it seems like it's often pushing us toward things that aren't so great?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? And Schopenhauer, in his typical fashion, doesn't offer any, easy answers or step-by-step programs.
Oh, wait.
But he does point us in a particular direction. He was a big proponent of what he called the denial of the will to live, which sounds a lot more drastic than it actually is.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're not talking about, a mass extinction event here, are we?
Definitely not.
Okay.
He wasn't advocating for suicide or anything like that. He actually saw those impulses as another manifestation of the will, just flipped in the other direction. No, what Schopenhauer meant was that we can find a degree of freedom, a kind of peace, by recognizing the limits of the will and consciously choosing to detach from its constant demands.
So not giving in to every desire, every craving, every impulse that pops into our heads, that actually sounds kind of doable.
It is, in a way, but it's not about suppressing our desires entirely. It's more about shifting our relationship to them. Schopenhauer believed that one way to do this was through the experience of beauty, particularly through art. He saw art as offering a kind of temporary escape from the will, a way to step outside of our own desires and experience the world in a more objective, disinterested way.
So, gazing at a beautiful painting or listening to a moving piece of music can actually help us to detach from our own, ego-driven dramas. That's kind of a beautiful thought in itself.
It is. And he wasn't just talking about, high art either. He believed that even simple experiences of beauty in nature, a sunset, a starry sky, could have this effect on us if we allowed ourselves to really be present with them.
So it's about cultivating a sense of awe, of wonder, of being able to appreciate something outside of ourselves without needing to possess it or analyze it to death. I like it.
Exactly. And that, for Schopenhauer, is a step towards transcendence. It's about recognizing that there's something more to life than just the constant striving of the will.
Okay, so we've talked about art, we've talked about nature, but what about our relationships with other people? Because let's be real, those can be some of the biggest sources of both joy and suffering in our lives.
Absolutely. And that's where Schopenhauer's emphasis on compassion comes back in. Because once we recognize that everyone, even the people who annoy us the most, is driven by the same will to live, by the same fears and desires, it becomes a lot harder to judge them harshly or to hold on to anger and resentment.
So next time someone cuts me off in traffic, instead of laying on the horn, I should be thinking, there goes another soul, trapped in the throes of the will to live.
Something like that. But in all seriousness, practicing compassion, even in small ways, can have a profound impact on our own well-being, as well as on the world around us.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like if we can find a way to be more understanding, more forgiving with ourselves and others, maybe we can start to break down some of those barriers that the will to live throws up between us.
Exactly. And that's ultimately what Schopenhauer is pointing to, a way of being in the world that's less about conflict, less about striving, and more about acceptance, compassion, and finding those moments of peace and beauty wherever we can.
It's a different way of looking at things, that's for sure. But I have to say, after spending this time with Schopenhauer, even though some of his ideas are, let's face it, kind of a downer, there's also a strange sense of hope that comes from understanding them. Like, if we can face the truth about ourselves, about the forces that drive us, maybe we can start to create a different kind of reality, both for ourselves and for the world.
I think that's a great way to put it. Schopenhauer wasn't about sugarcoating reality or offering easy answers, but his work does leave us with a powerful invitation to look deeply into ourselves, to confront our own nature with honesty and courage, and to find our own path to a more meaningful and, dare I say, a more compassionate way of being.
It's a journey, that's for sure, and one that we're all on, whether we realize it or not. So listeners, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Arthur Schopenhauer, we want to leave you with this. What resonated with you today? What parts of Schopenhauer's philosophy challenged you, inspired you, or maybe even made you a little uncomfortable? We encourage you to continue exploring his work and see where it leads you. You might be surprised at what you discover about yourself, about human nature, and about the possibilities for living a more fulfilling and meaningful life, even in a world shaped by the will to live.